In statecraft, military might and diplomatic intent share a surprising vulnerability. They are entirely worthless if your adversary doesn't believe you will use them. This challenge of projecting true credibility plagues governments at the absolute extremes of geopolitics. It dictates whether a state can deter a nuclear-armed superpower, and it determines whether a government can de-escalate violence with a localized rebel insurgency. Across both of these vastly different arenas, success or failure hinges on a single counterintuitive law of strategic behavior. To successfully influence an adversary's calculus, a state cannot rely on maintaining maximum flexibility. Instead, it must deliberately eliminate its own safe options. We can see this dynamic modeled in a recent joint study from the National Defense University and the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. This document examines how the West must structure its forces to counter Russian strategies for regional coercion and conventional war. We can also see it in a recent political science analysis of large-scale quantitative data, measuring the outcomes of secret peace negotiations between democratic states and non-state armed groups. Despite analyzing subjects on opposite ends of the conflict spectrum, both documents outline the exact same theoretical framework. They are studies in what strategists call the costly signal. A costly signal is an action that forces an adversary to believe you, specifically because taking that action exposes your own state to severe, unavoidable damage if you attempt to back down later. Consider the military problem outlined in the defense report. Russian military doctrine relies on the threat of a local fait accompli in Eastern Europe. Utilizing their interior supply lines, Russian forces could theoretically launch an opportunistic strike to rapidly seize territory in a Baltic state before NATO forces could mobilize a defense. Holding that seized territory relies on freezing NATO's inevitable counter-mobilization. To do this, Russia's strategy dictates an immediate jump to the pre-nuclear rung of the escalation ladder. This involves deploying advanced non-nuclear capabilities, counter-space operations, cyber attacks, and theater-range land attack cruise missiles. The purpose here is deeply psychological. Striking key economic and infrastructure targets deep within Europe signals a high tolerance for imposing massive, widespread costs on NATO members, far beyond the initial conflict zone. If those conventional strikes fail to deter a response, the subsequent threshold is a limited, theater-level nuclear strike. The objective is to de-escalate the conflict by compelling the alliance to reconsider the risks of a counteroffensive. The entire strategy is engineered to make the cost of rescuing a single Baltic state appear vastly disproportionate to the risk absorbed by the rest of the alliance, effectively paralyzing NATO's collective decision-making. NATO's initial efforts to enhance conventional deterrence, centered on the Readiness Action Plan adopted at the 2014 Wales Summit, relied heavily on deploying light, rapid-reaction tripwire forces to the eastern flank. The tactical problem with a tripwire is that if it fails, NATO is forced to deploy massive reinforcements into a highly contested environment. Against Russia's integrated air defenses and strike capabilities, the alliance would have to fight a bloody war of attrition just to reach the front lines. The defense researchers conclude that deterrence against this strategy cannot rely on the promise of a delayed, large-scale rollback. It requires denying Russia a low-cost military option from the very first minute of the conflict. Raising those immediate costs requires a significant upfront investment in a much larger, heavier force, forward deployed directly along the eastern border. Crucially, this forward force must be multinational, integrating combat units from major nuclear powers like the United States and Britain into the local defense architecture. Placing major allied forces directly in the crosshairs acts as the ultimate costly signal. It physically guarantees that any local Russian aggression instantly engages the independent nuclear states, triggering a wider, uncontrollable war. That automatic escalation destroys the entire premise of the fait accompli. We find this exact same mechanical requirement for commitment when we shift from deterring conventional superpowers to the opposite extreme, a democratic state attempting to de-escalate violence with a non-state armed group. Internal conflicts often feature decades of intense violence. For example, during Spain's transition to democracy in the 1970s, the government engaged in intermittent talks to halt the escalating violence from the Basque separatist group, ETA. The primary hurdle to securing peace in these environments is that armed rebel groups possess a deeply ingrained structural mistrust of the state apparatus they are fighting. To bypass the political friction of negotiating with insurgents in plain sight, governments frequently initiate secret talks. This covert approach is intended to provide diplomatic flexibility, allowing the state to explore peace options without appearing weak to its voting public. But the quantitative analysis reveals a harsh paradox. The very secrecy that allows these talks to happen inherently destroys the government's ability to prove they are acting in good faith. Because covert negotiations are invisible to the electorate, the government can abandon them at any time without facing a political penalty. To the armed group, this lack of risk means the government's overtures are nothing more than cheap, meaningless talk. This chart models the central variable that dictates the success or failure of covert diplomacy, the specific rank of the representative the government sends to the table. Selecting a low-level representative provides the state with strategic deniability. However, because this low-ranking official carries no political weight, they fail to establish trust. The data shows this approach rarely leads to a reduction in rebel violence. Contrast this with sending a high-level official. This decision alters the strategic math by introducing a concept known as democratic audience costs. If secret negotiations led by high-ranking politicians leak to the press, the government faces immediate, severe domestic backlash. They risk electoral ruin for negotiating with an organization the public views as terrorists. We saw the effectiveness of this extreme political risk in the Colombian government's delicate, high-stakes negotiations with FARC leadership in Havana, which ultimately led to a peace agreement in 2016. An armed group will only de-escalate when they see a democratic government actively risking its own political survival to talk. Diplomatic credibility, it turns out, is purchased exclusively with domestic vulnerability. Placing these two models side by side reveals that the underlying architecture of strategic success is identical across domains. Militarily, NATO cannot rely on the promise of a future counterattack. It must physically anchor its major powers to the front line, mathematically proving to Russia that the alliance cannot back down without fighting a devastating wider war. Diplomatically, a democracy cannot rely on promises made in the dark. It must risk the careers of its senior leadership, proving to insurgents that the state is genuinely seeking a settlement. In both scenarios, the state achieves its objective not by maximizing its options, but by intentionally trapping itself in a position where retreat would be catastrophic. Basic human intuition suggests that in high-stakes environments, a rational leader should preserve their flexibility and always keep an off-ramp open. The strategic doctrine and the quantitative data prove the exact opposite. Flexibility is a liability. It invites aggression and breeds mistrust. True strategic leverage is only ever gained at the exact moment a state visibly and permanently removes its own escape routes.